yung title ng pinaka-class. Johnson pa, yung title ng querying the class. Dapat hindi nakikita yung ano ha? TV.
Zoom in 20.
Number 20. Pwede ka lang. Akit ko doon ako sa tayo. Down siguro ng pag. Dito ako ayun mo yung cue ko. 2 minutes. Naka-stream na tayo. Stand by everyone. 30. Wala. Tagal na lang. 20. Hindi wala akong ano, mali yung rin ako. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3,
Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the roundtable discussion on queering the classroom, education for everyone, brought to you by the UP Center for Education and Development under the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs and the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies. My name is Frankie Cruz from UPCWGS. I will be your host along with Brian Senga, who's also from UPCWGS.
Hello, good afternoon.
Our roundtable is being broadcast live on the DZUP, UPCWGS, and OVPAA Facebook pages, as well as the DZUP YouTube channel. The RTD will be followed by a question and answer portion to talk a bit about the program. If you have a question later on, please also use your name and affiliation when asking the question. So our RTD today is it's an informal discussion really on our speakers' experiences about queering the classroom. All of our speakers come from education. They have been students and do teach currently. And when we speak of queering the classroom, we ask how we teach, what we teach, and who we teach. And through that question the assumptions that normally come into this process of teaching and developing the syllabus and the curriculum in general. Queering the classroom asks not marginalized students to conform to some of these assumptions, but asks of the institution why these norms exist and how they continue to be perpetuated, and how we can have actually a more inclusive classroom for all. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers today, starting with Luis. So Luis Emmanuel Abisamis is a community-engaged health social scientist with transdisciplinary training in anthropology, psychology, and sociology. They hold a bachelor's degree in behavioral science from UP, Manila, and a master's in health social science from De La Salle University in Manila. As a public health and gender consultant, Luis has contributed to and led research projects for national and international institutions, including the WHO, UNAIDS, and the British Academy. Currently, they are a senior lecturer at the UP Diliman Department of Sociology and a fellow of UPCWGS. Their research interests include transgender health, critical drug policy studies, and the social histories of public health. So, Luis Avesans.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Okay. Our next speaker is Holden Kenneth Alcazarin, an assistant professor of the UPD Department of Speech Communication and Theater Arts, and is finishing his PhD in education, major in language education at UP Diliman. Currently, he is teaching instructional communication and speech communication research methods classes at the department. His research interests are language education, instructional communication, and genderqueer studies. Welcome, Holden.
Thank you, Frankie. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, and our third speaker is Dr. Rosel Pineda. Dr. Rosel Pineda is a curator, dramaturge, educator, scholar, community worker, and artist activist. She currently serves as the Associate Dean for Research, Creative Work, Extension, and Publication at the College of Arts of Letters, UP Diliman. She's also teaching at the Department of Art Studies, the same university. She is the founder and artistic director of Aurora Artist Residency Program and Space, a community-based art organization, and the Performance Curators Initiatives, a global network of performance curators based in the Philippines. She holds a PhD in creative arts at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia, with a research focus on ethics in community-engaged arts with Indigenous communities. Welcome, Dr. Rosel Pineda.
Magandang hapon sa lahat. Happy Pride!
Happy Pride! Okay, our next speaker is Jeff Rojas. Jeff Rojas is a teacher and a student. They teach Spanish at the Department of European Languages at UP Diliman and study Women and Development Studies at the College of Social Work and Community Development at the same university. They find pleasure reading and writing research on language and gender, critical pedagogy, and migration and sexuality. Welcome, Jeff.
Mike, hello. Thank you, Frankie. Happy Pride.
And last but not least, Lakan Umali is a Palanca Award-winning novelist and an assistant professor at the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Welcome, Lakan, to our RTD.
Thank you so much, Frankie, for having me. It's such a great honor and pleasure to be with such esteemed company today.
And thanks to all our speakers once again. And I'd also like to introduce my co-host for today, Brian Senga.
Yes, thank you, Frankie. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Brian Senga. I'm from the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies. Again, thank you to our speakers for joining us here today, and also Ma'am Rosel for joining us online for this roundtable discussion on queering the classroom. So I think we can start naman na, no? Our main central question actually here is simply, what does queering the classroom mean in your specific institutional context? No? And I know you come from different fields of social science, speech communication, language, art studies, literature, gender studies in general. Now, maybe we could start first with institutional definitions, institutional assumptions. No? So my question is, what does our curriculum currently assume about who the default student is, no? Whose experience as students are oftentimes universalized, no? And where does that assumption show up in terms of syllabus, classroom practices, expectations on how students and even teachers should act? Ayan. Meron bang gustong mauna sa atin?
I guess I can start.
Okay, let's first have Luis.
Yeah, so when I was reflecting on this, no, parang I first started teaching kasi at the Health Sciences Center at UP Manila. So actually maraming assumptions about who the students are, no? For example, doon may expectation talaga na yung mga estudyante magme-med school or something along those lines, public health, dentistry, and whatnot, no? So yung pagtugon sa gender or even rethinking certain taken for granted things, hindi siya masyadong expected in that space. I mean, just to give you an idea, at the undergrad level, there's only 2 classes dedicated to gender. So, kulang yung space to even queer the classroom from a curricular or pedagogical perspective. But I would say, just drawing from my experience from both UP Manila and UP Diliman, I think one clear thing that we see is that merong, and I don't know if the other panelists can also share their insights on it, there are certain biological assumptions about the students and just the general UP community. Like, this is something I've been trying to teach my students as well in my health sociology classes. No? Parang sabi ko, pay attention to how our spaces are designed. Within the classroom, for instance, I always ask them, how many of you are left-handed? And how many of you have chairs that accommodate that particular need? And then, meron din ako. Hello? Yes. Okay. Carry lang. Tapos, I also asked them, na parang, okay, we're in the 2nd floor, in the 3rd floor. Naisip nyo ba, parang, what if you have a classmate na kailangan gumamit ng wheelchair or just may mobility issue siya? Wala tayong ganong klaseng access, no? And those are things that are, obviously we might sequester to disability inclusion. But I would say that also yung mga biological assumptions, that also feeds into how we understand our students in general. I'm not sure to what extent, for example, intersex experiences are being discussed in the classroom. No? Parang may assumptions ba tayo na lahat ng tao sa UP, their sex characteristics fall neatly within the categories of male and female. So may mga ganun akong parang reflections na others can also parang share their insights on.
Feel free to jump in. Feel free.
I would like to agree with Louis' answers regarding different assumptions that we have for her students. And siguro, I'll just emphasize that in terms of assumptions and expectations of students, it's always the teacher's assumption of students. When I say this, it's because of the different conversation that we have with my colleagues, with senior faculty and junior faculty. That's why we always tell each other na baka yung assumption natin sa mga estudyante ay hindi talaga estudyante natin. Because we're probably just reflecting what we know of them because probably whoever we are as students before, pinoproject lang natin doon sa estudyante na meron tayo ngayon. So I think that's also one interesting insight that my conversations with my colleagues always happen. For instance, when we talk about student regulating their learning, how do students learn now? Mahirap mag-impose of what kind of requirements, what kind of pedagogies, if alam natin na sa sarili natin na this works for me, but we're not sure if this works for our students. And tama si Luis na most of our assumptions come from probably the dominant discourse and the dominant belief that we have. Are they usually, ang tingin natin, lahat sila able bodies. Sa tingin natin, kayang mabasa yung ating mga slide decks kahit malayo sila. Nakakarinig sila ng mga videos na pinapanood natin sa kanila. They have stable internet. That's why okay lang sa atin. Okay, we're expecting them to do online synchronous or online asynchronous because ang expectation natin are they are capable. They do have the means and resources to do that. And I think one question of Brian is, saan nagmamanifest yun sa ating curriculum? And this is where I think in education we call it the hidden curriculum. This might not be seen in how our learning objectives or course content, but there are these assumptions that are embedded with how the curriculum would suggest certain concepts. For instance, of course, there are different, as part of the speech communication, we do have different courses that involve understanding relationships. That's why may interpersonal communication kami. So, ano ba yung tinitingnan natin dun sa relationships na yun? Are we always talking about family or relationships, romantic relationships, friendships? Then of course, and not all faculty members would have probably experiences as I do have as a queer person that might not be sort of fleshed out in a conventional or in their classrooms. Now, whereas a queer educator would have certain vernaculars or would have certain experiences that would allow them to really tell the students na ito yung nangyayari, let's say in a queer relationship. Or ito yung nangyayari if you have two dads or two moms. So, yeah, I mean, usually it would be manifested with the teaching inside of the classroom. Sometimes nakikita sa course content at hopefully with the curricular revisions that I think all of our departments are having, hopefully ma-manifest yung queering the classroom na ginagawa natin.
All right, thank you, Holden. How about you?
Magja-jump ako. Ay.
Yes, po, Ma'am Russell.
Ayan, sige. Siguro, simulan natin sa, lahat naman tayo may assumptions, no? So, whether you're queer or not, no, you have assumptions of many things, no? Ang tanong ay, kung paano ito nag-manifest, no, syempre kasi ang curriculum, ang any curriculum is a merging of framework and methodology yan, eh. And usually, linear, no? Ang pagtanaw natin sa ano ba yung learning outcomes and learning objectives mo sa isang classroom. Madalas sa hindi na yun nga parang may linear yan. So ibig sabihin meron kang framework na ini-impose sa iyong classroom to get to a certain outcome. And meron ka ding methodologies, no, methods how to get there. No, madalas sa hindi ang education ay outcomes based. Madalas sa hindi ay competency based, no. Ibig sabihin you're expected to have certain competencies after your class, no? Whether makabasa ka. Ito yung sinasabi ni Holden kanina, no? At saka ni Luis kanina na napaka-ableist, no? Ng idea natin ng pagkatuto. Rather than think about the complexities of learning perhaps, or even the bodies that learn, or relationships. So nafa-flatten, no? Madalas sa hindi na sa isang classroom, merong certain level of flattening, no, ng ating proseso to get to certain outcomes na gusto natin. Hindi lang yan nagmamanifest sa queer experiences kasi napaka-complex ng queer identities, queer experiences, queer advocacies, no? Lalo na pag pinag-usapan pa natin ang katawan, no? How the body performs queerness, how the body performs gender, sexuality, no? So madalas yan nafa-flatten yan sa isang classroom, no? Lalo na kung tinitingnan natin na may period, may time frame, no? Ang isang class, ang isang classroom setting, no? So I think aside from that, yun yung idadagdag ko, no? Sa mga sinabi na ni Holden at ni Luis na binanggit nila, in-emphasize nila yung structures, in-emphasize nila yung assumptions ng nagpapatakbo o nagpa-facilitate ng isang classroom. Pero idadagdag ko rin na when you make your curriculum, no, it's a certain framework that you are trying to for a lack of a better term, no, impose or apply. At meron kang methods, meron kang methodology to get there. And unfortunately, like what I said, no, most of our outcomes na gustong patunay, whether it's primary, secondary, and even tertiary, no, and even grad school sometimes, no, ay outcomes based. 'Di ba? Kaya ka nga ginigradean sa huli, hindi ba? Meron kang dapat outcomes at dapat yung outcome mo ay umaayon sa certain standards or na-achieve ang isang goal na inilatag mo sa isang classroom. So outcomes based 'yan at saka yun nga, parang may methods ka together. And most of the time, that flattens experiences, that flattens the complexities of the processes, and also that flattens yung mismong identities, no? And that relationship, sabi nga ni Holden kanina. So siguro doon na muna kasi iba pa yung question ng how do we address that? No. So, yun na muna ang aking dagdag doon sa nasabi na ni Luis at ni Holden.
Yes, we'll get to that question on how we address. But before that, maybe we could hear from Lacan and Jeff. Sige, si Jeff na lang muna.
As a duo.
At the same time.
I feel like it's important to acknowledge in this conversation that the act of queering in itself comes from the long history of queer and feminist politics, right? At ang dami ng naging chika, nasabi tungkol sa queer theory. Pero I think this is very characteristic of its postmodern and post-structuralist roots, right? Na walang iisang katotohanan lang sa mundo at sa dinami-rami ng mga katotohanan at pagkakaintindi natin tungkol sa mundo, trabaho ng queer theory na kalkalin yung mga katotohanan na tinatago, ibida at isentro ang katotohanang bakla kasama ng iba't ibang mga katotohanan. At dapat itong nakikita at nararamdaman sa iba't ibang institusyon, katulad ng bahay, sa pamilya, sa estado, sa ekonomiya, lalong-lalo na dito sa paaralan kung saan kadalasan binubuo ang mga katotohanan. So I agree with Rosel, Luis, and Holden na our assumptions of as a default acceptable student comes from hegemonic representations of a human being. And the human being must be able-bodied, must be white, must be middle class, and must be straight, right? At itong pag-iisip na ito, it is reflective and prevalent in our daily classroom interactions, especially in the form of questioning of professors to students, or even students to professor, right? Ako bilang guro ng Espanyol, for instance, isa ako sa mga nagtuturo ng Spanish 10 at 11. It's elementary Spanish. At isa sa mga objectives ng elementary Spanish is to be able to present and describe families, your friends, your partners, no? The most important people of your lives, sabi nga ni Janina San Miguel. And so normally, we ask male students if they have girlfriends and female students if they have boyfriends, right? And no matter how innocent this question we consider them to be, they are actually not innocent questions because they reinforce the idea that the only valid relationship is that of between a man and a woman, obliterating other sexualities, even as sexual identities, right? Second example that I want to share in this table is yung ibaon mo na lang ako sa lupa case. So, nandito kami sa usapan ng pamilya since na-bring up ni Holden. So, yun nga, di ba? In the Unit 2 of Spanish 10 and 11, where they are meant to describe their families, right? Para lumabas yung adjectives of personality, tapos yung mga basic information ng mga pamilya nila. Tapos, I asked one student, ¿Cómo son tus padres? How are your parents like? Tapos she corrected me by saying, no tengo padres, I don't have parents. Tengo madres. Because in Spanish, padres could refer to a father and a mother, or even fathers, right? Tapos, tengo madres, and more than the hiya that I experience and shame, and I shall give myself grace, it's actually a point of enlightenment for me, which made me realize that the concept of family does not necessarily have to do with blood relations, right? And also not restricted to the gender binary, you know, father, mother, lolo, lola, man, and woman, because it invisibilizes other concepts of family, like, for instance, single mothers, single parents, what else? Fur families, for instance, I consider my dog as my own family. Also, chosen family, which queer people choose. So, etong mentalidad na to sa atin na our default assumption of a student, nagre-reflect siya sa ating classroom interactions. Yes.
Thank you, Jeff. And now finally, from Lacan.
Hello. Okay, drawing from what everyone had richly contributed to the discussion, I think that a lot of these assumptions stem from, like what Jeff and Marcel talked about, they stem from the fact that you have to be able-bodied to keep up with the demands of Philippine education. The Philippine education system is still in a crisis, and the institutions which govern this educational system still come up with all of these solutions which don't actually work. I think the latest one was transforming the school year into trimester or removing GE courses, which all serve to hide the fact that a lot of this crisis stems from this obsession with outcomes and this obsession with competencies. Because so much of what we teach, especially us in the humanities, especially, for example, creative writing, English, like what I teach, so much of what we teach cannot be accurately measured by these competencies. Sometimes even the idea of having a set rubric goes against the basic notion of creative writing, because there is no checklist of what constitutes good writing, the social criteria of what constitutes good literature, or even of what is literature changes over time, as Terry Eagleton illustrates. And I think this logic is something which completely goes against this obsession with standardization, with outcomes, with having students produce and produce. And that's something which continuously shocks me in the classroom, no matter how much I hear it. I always ask students what they're made to do in senior high school, and they always talked about having to write paper after paper, make research after research, getting burnt out, not having the time to digest what they learned, because they're always asked to create some kind of outcome. And what has that led to us right now? Not just the marginalization of queer students, of students that are members of minority communities or sectors, but to this widespread educational crisis where a great chunk of senior high school students still are not functionally literate. And that just further exacerbates the larger social, economic, cultural, and moral crisis which we're facing today. So I think the importance of queering the classroom, it's not just to give queer educators and queer students proper recognition and a proper voice in the classroom, but really to give everyone, whether they be queer or not, because queerness is fluid. They might not be queer one day, but then they might come into queerness. Like what the theorist Sarah Ahmed talked about, privilege. Privilege is sometimes like a garment that fits some people better than others, much like how our curriculum and how our protocols and institutions fit some people better than others. And even if you are able-bodied, cisgendered, I think a lot of institutions in the Philippines are not just ableist, but actively hostile to everyone. Like you can be a perfectly mentally, physically healthy person when you get into UP. And then the demands of the system might completely challenge that and destroy that, no? And I remember, I think, I was kind of at the tail end of an undergraduate in the pre-pandemic where there was still a lot of For some reason, a lot of people saw UP's and higher education's exclusivity as some kind of bragging right. People would brag about how many students would drop out of a class or how many students would fail out of a course. And for a lot of people, that seemed to be a mark of higher education's excellence. When if you think about it, why? Why would you brag about that? Why would you brag about how many students are suffering burnout or failing out of a course? Isn't that a mark of miseducation? So I think ultimately we have to pack up. We have to tear apart these assumptions. These assumptions that everything is a competition. These assumptions that students, we have to make them compete against each other to get louder. No, because that just isn't good for anybody, Brian.
Right, thank you, Lakan. So now we have foregrounded that a lot of the methodologies embedded in our educational institution across fields actually are favoring certain bodies, certain bodies that are masculine, bodies that are heteronormative of a certain class, and not just actually bodies, but also systems of inequality, because this conversation is not about the classroom. It goes beyond that. But of course, since the topic is queering the classroom, I want to know how each one of you actually design mechanisms for inclusion that accounts for those differences. But before that, of course, ano ba rin yung mga actual experiences of your own queer students? What evidence do we have? What evidence do we have, and what are the gaps? And when I mean queer students, I don't just mean queer in a sense na along the lines of gender and sexuality, but queer in a sense na students who have for the longest time yung kanilang sensibilities ay madalas ay hindi na-favoran ng current system natin.
Yeah, I'd also like to add on to what Jeff talked about. So a very concrete from within the classroom where you were confronted with, I don't feel that I was inclusive enough, or I wish it weren't the way. So I'd also like to hear about that from you. Did you encounter these, and how did you address them, if at all? I mean, of course, there's the systematic level, but there's also then this interpersonal level or in classroom setting with students.
Pwede ba ako magsimula since ako yung pinakamatanda, pinakamatagal,
Okay.
na
Yes,
nagtuturo. Siguro, ako muna yung tanggapin nila. Charos! Because I'm very different, my language is very different. I'm older now, but when I was younger, I look very different, hindi lang sa mga kapwa ko guro, kung hindi pati sa mga estudyante. So I'm a performance artist, so I would look different, I would carry myself different, I would dress up differently. Hindi ako nagbabra sa classroom. Hindi ko na kaya yun ngayon. Pero hindi ako nagbabra sa classroom. Hindi ako nag-shave ng aking mga body hair. So there's a lot of talk, even amongst my students na either I'm looked at as parang may pagka-circus, parang oy doon tayo kay Pineda kasi kakaiba siya yung itsura niya, hindi nagbabrayan, o kaya naman laging nagmumura, mga ganyan, mapagmura yan sa classroom, So siguro parang yung performativity ko in itself is already kind of breaking that those assumptions, many of those assumptions, especially during our time siguro. Pero ang magandang, ito yung addressing, ang magandang nangyayari doon is that sa classrooms talagang ine-emphasize ko that it's a safe space. Because I myself, ever since bata ako, is already treated as an outcast, coming from a public school setting na sinasabi ng mga teacher na magaling sana sa academics pero may attitude problem, just because I carry myself differently, ang tomboy ako, nakikipagbunong braso ako, nakikipagbardagulan ako, ganyan. So bilang isang babae bilang isang nilalang na nakaranas all throughout, no? Kahit nung bata pa and not being able to process that, no? Um, kinakailangan ko na nung naging guro ako ay yun ang pinakamahalaga, no? And when I say safe space, no, I have to make sure that we can converse about anything, no? Pinalawak ko yung threshold ko for language, pinalawak yung threshold for various experiences. Buti na lang, mas malawak yata yung pagkabaliw ko sa mas marami kong estudyante. So medyo expansive na yun. Plus also, dahil galing ako sa arts, no? I think it's a responsibility of artists to be able to always think about those boundaries and expand those, no? So kumbaga yung aking practice ay pagpapalawak ng boundaries na ita-translate yon o dapat na ita-translate yon sa classroom. And I find that ever since, no, generations of my students, marami actually nag-out sa klase ko. They would talk to me and say na, buti na lang, ganyan yung classroom niyo man kasi I'm able to express my sexuality. Lalo na siguro dati. Pero hindi lang yun. Marami ring nagsasabi sa akin tungkol sa kanilang mga karanasan sa sexual violence, sa hindi lang harassment, kundi yung mga traumas nila. No? And that's something that I had to learn as well. No? Kahit na hindi ako masasabing lisensyado na psychologist, no? Pero bilang guro at bilang artista, kailangan alam natin kung paano maging compassionate, paano makinig, at paano ano ng isang classroom na humubog ng isang classroom na ligtas sa expressions at kasaysayan at karanasan at storya ng marami. I think it helped that I'm funny. Joker talaga ako. I'm funny. So I'm the style of a comedian that self-depreciates. So that kind of nababag ka yung idea nila na, merong si ma'am nga kaya niyang pagtawanan yung sarili niyang katawan. You know? So that helps. And I use that. I use all types of methods, tools in order to make my students, my colleagues feel safe. No? So siguro yun yung aking throughout the years naging karanasan.
Ayan. Thank you po, Ma'am Rosel, for sharing your personal experience. No? What I'm getting from your sharing is your own way of queering, even the idea of what it means to be a professional. No? Because sometimes merong mga expectations of us na if you think about it, only favors certain sensibilities and medyo exclusionary siya of certain practices na parte ng lived experiences of a lot of queer people. I'm curious though, kay Luis, i-direct ko yung question kay Luis, no? Since you're coming from a field of public health, health social sciences, you meet people of different, perhaps traditions, like in terms of their disciplines, no? Do you experience the similar way of queering in your field? May similar challenges ba? Or is it easier or harder in your case? But of course, you can also share on other things.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I actually really wanted to respond to what Ma'am Rosel shared. Kasi yun yung pinanggagalingan ko is public health. Sorry. Carry lang. Public health, gender development, no? So, in my classroom, obviously may mga theoretical, empirical papers, but my discussion also includes yung experiences ko from the field, no? And as an interdisciplinary scholar then, teaching in a very disciplinary program, for instance, minsan yung thing sa estudyante is that hindi ako expert sa field na yon kasi mas lived experience ko yung sinishare ko. No? So, I resonate well with yung sinishare ni Ma'am Rosello na parang even tayo as professors, parang we kind of have to be, we're kind of queer in that sense as well. No? Na may expectation yung estudyante of us and how we're supposed to teach. No? And it also sort of sets the tone for the learning in the classroom. Kasi may expectations and as we've been sharing, may expectations din tayo of students. In terms naman of engaging, for example, in these different fields, something I really struggled with engaging, for example, with the public health sector is sila kasi when they engage with the academe, ano talaga siya, parang ang tingin nila sa academics ay experts. It's the social sciences and humanities. Meron tayong reflexivity and sort of discontent with the term expert, no? So, parang tayo, or for example, like me, I try to be reflexive in that sense, no? Na parang, I don't really like being called an expert and all of these things. Pero binulungan ako ng isang friend ko na parang, hindi, ganito yung norm sa ganitong space, no? At kung, especially since I work, for example, with people who use drugs, sex workers, yung mga key population sa HIV cascade of care, oftentimes wala sila in the room. So, policymakers, program implementers, the reason why they're engaging academics is kasi ang assumption nila is the academics have the connections. So, parang yung, nung colleague ko is, if you downplay yung totoong, naman na, you're connected with communities, you're working with them, you do more injustice to the community, no? Na parang, tanggapin mo na tinatawag kang expert, and then just, leverage it for good. Siguro, yung strategies ko, coming from that, no? How do I implement that in the classroom? Two major things, no? For me, nasa syllabus siya and in my orientation na I don't dictate what constitutes an emergency for my students. So, alam kong sa UP manual, merong death of a family member, public health kineso. For me, hindi yun yung nakalagay. For me, it's ang nakalagay non-verbatim is parang if you have an emergency, just let me know. Let's talk about next steps. No, so I let the students decide what constitutes an emergency for them. For if one student, a panic attack is an emergency, yung isa hindi. Who am I to, dictate that? No. In my experience, that has led to some very interesting emails from students na medyo TMI na kakanis. Gore lang. Like, I had a student who was like, I have carpal tunnel. I'm like, okay. Like, okay, great. Sige, at least you feel safe to, yung hindi ka lang nag-cut ng class. No, but yung ganong design of the classroom, I feel it's a little bit more consequential for students who are actually undergoing yung mga emergencies. I had this one student na nag-open up siya just before taking a quiz na sabi, prof, okay lang po ba na I leave early kasi pupunta siya sa court. Basically, they were, I won't go into the details, but they were exercising their rights and pursuing a case against someone. No? Ang akin was, are you sure you want to take the quiz? We can reschedule for you, walang problem. No, sabi, hindi, prof, tatapusin ko yung quiz ko and then pupunta ako. And I was like, okay, great. See, I'll respect what you want. But at any point, you feel like you just want to go to court instead, carry lang. I feel that is why we design, or why I designed my classroom in that way. No, I let my students decide. It's because truly, parang we don't really know what they're going through. And the moment we define, for me, is the moment we start limiting. No, ano yung mga pwedeng gawin ng mga estudyante. So another thing related to that, no? Even if I teach public health and sociology, one thing na my students I'm confident will share about my classroom is I never ask for medical certificates.
Okay.
And that's because medical certificates are hard to access.
Yes.
And usually, yung mga estudyante, they will have to take an extra day out of the many days they've already been absent just to acquire that. No, I still have students who submit medical certificates. No, and I'm just like, okay, that's great, thank you. Pero, and I've been in discussion with other faculty members about this. Na stern sila, hindi, kailangan may medical certificate. Some people nga, they ask even for death certificates. Akin is, I'm not doing it for those people who take advantage, supposedly, of those policies na mag-absent sabihin may sakit. Ang iniisip ko is yung mga estudyante na hirap na nga sila, nagkasakit pa sila, pahihirapan ko pa sila. So those are the concrete ways na I'm redesigning my classroom just based on my, not just my experience, but also yung, ano yung tinuturo ko about health and society.
All right, thank you, Luis. I actually have a follow-up question, but later na lang after everyone's turn para lahat din makasagot. How about this side? Lakan, Jeff? Sige, let's have Lakan.
I think it's important to be available, to listen and to talk to students. Because as I grow older, and the gap between me and very awkward Totoy, 16-year-old, acne-ridden, kind of like so super gay Lakan, na parang, oh my God, nakatapos na ako sa UP, I can be as gay as I want. After being closeted for so long in a Catholic high school, as the gap between me and that person grows wider, no? I try to remember what I was like then, and how I was earnest I was, and how I enjoyed talking to my English teachers after class, even just about books. And then when I started teaching, I realized, oh my God, I'm so tired after teaching. So tired after teaching. But, you know, I realized na my English teachers, my old profs, no matter how tired they were, they always took the time to talk to me, to not even for an emergency, just to like create human connection. And that's something I always try to bring in the classroom now that I'm on the other side of the classroom. That, of course, like, not all of us have the capacity to be there to listen. We all go through things. But when we do have the capacity, when we can listen, I do think it's very important to listen and to talk to students, especially, you know, if we sense and we notice that they really need someone to talk to, because the world outside is just really scary, and like so many terrible things are still happening, even during Pride. Transphobia is rampant, homophobia is rampant. Unfortunately, so many students still experience this even at home. So oftentimes, they have no one else to go to except to their teacher that they might feel is a little bit more open. And yeah, sometimes it's tiring after 1.5 hours of talking to talk even more, but I still think that when it's possible, it's important to talk to them and to listen to them, to make them feel seen and heard, because even though we might not be able to solve all of their problems, at least they would feel like someone is there and they would feel recognized instead of feeling like this kind of object whose sole purpose is to pass and get an uno, to make them feel human even for a moment. So I think that's something that we can do in the classroom to help make it a more constructive and conducive environment. So kapag may lumalapit sa akin pagkatapos ng class, sasabihin, Ma'am, I think bakla ako. Sasabihin ko sa kanya, ay bakit bakla lang? Di pwede trans. Sure. Push mo na yun. Sure. Yeah.
Sige. Thank you, Lakan. Yung question ko actually, sige, baka pwedeng sagutin na rin nung iba, was sort of related to what the three of you earlier said, no? Kasi for context, there is a study out there that gives a number in terms of the cost of discrimination. Yan. So parang it promotes na, we should be more inclusive kasi ito yung nawawala natin pera. But at the same time, the other perspective is that, you know, there is also an added sort of labor in our practice of queering, no? And sometimes in that process, yung pag-center natin sa care, it becomes an emotional labor as well, di ba? Later on, we will talk about institutional support, but yung gusto kong idagdag dun sa question is, given these experiences of students and how you handle them, kayo din, like how do you handle yourselves, then how do you center yung care not just for your students but also for yourselves? Ayan. Sige, maybe Holden and Jeff. Good start.
Okay. Just for context, I've been teaching for almost more than a decade. So I've been teaching before UP. I've been teaching in public and private institutions from elementary to high school. Isipin nyo na lang paano ako maging elementary teacher. And then when I meet graduates and students, they would always say na, "Sir, bakla na ako." Hala, bakit? And the same goes, the same, bakit na-associate nyo sa akin? Bakit may association bigla? And siguro because my line of question is that I never disclosed anything to my students before, especially knowing that they're high school students, they're elementary students. And at that time, I felt that I don't need to disclose anything to them. It's not really part of the things or information that they should know. Now going back and then reflecting on that, in my field of instructional communication and speech comm, this is a term we call critical communication pedagogy, where one part in strategy that CCP involves is intentionality. That we're supposed to be in tension with the pedagogies that we have. And that includes the line of questioning that we have in our classroom, the kind of care that we give to our students and to ourselves as well, the kind of, siguro the language that we use inside of our classroom. Siguro, and also, aside from intentionality, it's also important of, siguro, how do questions or how do we teach students to question? Meron ba tayong time na tinanong natin ng estudyante, tinatanong nyo ba sa mga teachers nyo kung bakit ganun yung requirements? Tinatanong nyo ba sa teachers nyo kung bakit 2 weeks lang yung deadline? So, and in those kinds of things, your classes become spaces, not just for spaces or safe spaces for them to disclose traumatic experiences, but also safe spaces for them to question and disrupt what we call the hegemonic discourses that usually our curriculum would have. And the same goes with, if students are allowed to question, then we can also be, as teachers, would have a safe space for us to even question what are we even talking about. Na parang nagtuturo kami ng, for instance, nagtuturo ako ng assessment. Kailangan pa ba ng assessment? Just ko nagugunaw ng mundo, magpapa-paper pen and test pa ako. Or magtuturo pa ako how to make a quiz. So, and that's where siguro the intentionality comes in. Ano ba yung kinds of concepts and pedagogies that we welcome in our classes that siguro our students and myself as a teacher would think that, okay, it could be socially relevant. That's why, for instance, as an evidence in our subject of assessment, we teach what we call flexible assessment. So this is where, in a way, students can negotiate. Ito yung criteria, na kailangan. And of course, some students might be resistant with that because this is not a practice that our students had. Hindi nila practice na mag-negotiate ng criteria or deadlines even. And in one case of like flexible assessment is even yung grading ba ay mangyayari after, before, or during. So, and those kinds of questions and those kinds of conversation, one might be uncomfortable, might create discomfort with the professor and with the teacher, and also with the students. Mm-hmm. So, and in a way, and through understanding the importance of questioning, the importance of having a space to even question our own pedagogies, I think that's a way for us to really queer the kind of classrooms that we have. So, yeah.
Let's finally have Jeff, and then we'll allow yung mga speakers then to also respond if they would like.
I think, Brian, ang ganda at ang importante ng tanong na yan because that question recognizes that teaching is care work at the end of the day. And, yun, queering the classroom, entails reciprocated care too, na responsable tayo to make our classes inclusive, but also students also have the responsibility to to submit their papers, to submit their requirements. So both sides must understand these boundaries at the same time. So tungkol din sa strategies on how to queer the classroom, especially kung medyo baguhan tayo sa queering the classroom, is I have two pieces of advice because I approach that question in value formation. First is to take your time. Second is to cultivate allies and to start organizing. I acknowledge that issues on gender and sexuality in which queering the classroom stands in, it's a lot to take in. And I know this perfectly because I too was once in that position. It involved a long, tough process of unlearning and relearning knowledge systems. But what I'm saying here is that put yourself out there. Discomfort is normal, but make sure that that discomfort is productive. And the mere fact of questioning your syllabus, evaluating whether it is gender inclusive or not, just the matter of reflecting is already an act of queering, which you should tap yourself on the back already. But also, lagi siyang nagsisimula sa personal, na tulad ng sinasabi ng feminist politics. Pero ibabahagi din natin ito sa ating mga colleagues, and then which could translate into policies, into projects on para mas maging collective na ang pagbakla ng classroom. Yan.
All right. Anything to add from the rest of the speakers?
Can I add, Brian brought up that very good point about how it might also be additional emotional labor for the teacher, and also to recognize that, because usually what kind of teachers tend to take upon this additional labor? Usually women teachers. Usually women teachers, in addition to also taking upon the labor of processing people's emotions in maybe their home or work lives, have that additional, I don't want to say burden, but maybe expectation of being there for students. And that's why also I think it's kind of hard to address that question, because it's part of larger issues of who is always expected to be there to listen, who is always expected to be there to bear that emotional, all of that emotional baggage. But in the moment when it does actually happen, it's really hard to turn away, because sometimes a student really does need you. So I do think that that's where negotiation comes in. Yung paninimpla. How do we negotiate being there for students in more meaningful ways, but at the same time also being there for ourselves? I think that's also the challenge of creating a new relationality, maybe a more queer relationality between teacher and student. I understand why people say that the classroom is a second home, but I don't like it. I understand it because it's the reality that for a lot of students, they see teachers as second parents, and there is that responsibility. But at the same time, I don't like it because it speaks of the fact that teaching, which has generally been a female-led profession, has to take on that additional familial, personal burden. And also because the family itself can be a very feudal institution. No? So I think that, but on the other hand also, I think that teaching, it's unavoidable to come into those more personal entanglements where you really do have to maybe provide guidance to a student that's outside of the curriculum. So I think that's a challenge for us teachers, no? How do we maintain both that professional boundary, but also address the day-to-day concerns that students really do, really do have? And I think that's where also Jeff's comment comes in, that it's a two-way street, that yes, we have to also see students as people, but students also have to see us as people, na hindi lang tayo yung tagabigay ng grades, ng rubrics. I think that's part of the larger project of going beyond this incredibly quantitative system of measuring success, and trying to actually be there for each other in more meaningful ways to create a more fruitful classroom.
Ayan. It's nice that you
So,
mentioned that. No? Ay, sige. Ma'am Rosel, may dadagdag ko.
Sige. Susugan ko yung sinabi ni Lacan at saka ni Jeff, no. Ako throughout the years, hindi ko alam kung, yan yung lagi kong tinitimpla because I'm a very vulnerable teacher. And I find that vulnerability as a way to really connect, no, with a lot of my students who doesn't share the same experience or background sa akin, no. And siguro may kinalaman na rin yan kasi ang aking main medium of artistry is performance. So body-based talaga yan. So in ka dun sa lahat ng pwede mong halukayin sa katawan mo. So that's something that's always been kind of, for a lack of a better term, parang an ambivalent relationship with the vulnerability. But essentially, okay, ano siya, no? I find it a very good framework, no, pa rin. Pero minsan hindi mo alam paano mo alagaan yung sarili mo. Kasi nga you're putting yourself so much out there, emotions, pati katawan, di ba? Pati katawan, emosyon, in conversations, yung ganyan. No? So hayag na hayag ka, no? And sometimes I don't know how to take care of myself. But I find that siguro very practical ito, no? Very practical na reminder. One is to surround yourself with good people, no? And not everybody, and we have to be realistic that not everybody in our workspace ay good people. And when I say good people, hindi mabuting tao. I'm not even saying mabait, no? But mabuting tao. Yung makakapagbigay sa'yo ng gabay, kung paano mas maging makatao at maging mabuting tao for yourself and for your students and for your colleagues. Kailangan throughout the years natututunan natin how to paano i-distansya yung sarili natin sa mga toxic na mga colleagues. Reality yan. At bahagi yan ng pag-aalaga sa ating sarili. The other is, I think I mentioned it a while ago. I laugh a lot, no? I think I'm funny, and I laugh a lot, and that's something that I don't want to lose. Kapag dumating na sa puntong hindi ka na nakakangiti at nakakatawa, ngayon, you need self-care. Yun na yung hudyat mo. Yun na yung hudyat mo na kailangan mo ng mating ng kakaiba sa sarili mo. So listen to your bodies. Listen to yourself, no? Hindi ako laging successful diyan. Dahil I tend to really, grind my body a lot. But as I grow older, mas natututunan ko nang mas maging kaibigan yung katawan ko. Mas natututunan ko na siyang pakinggan kahit nagtatalo pa rin kami madalas. Pero it's a relationship. I think Lacan said that also, no? It's a relationship with yourself on how to take care of yourself because our profession kind of compels you to go outside yourself, eh. At bahagi yun ng pagiging isang mabuting guro, isang mabuting artista, creative practitioner, or even researcher, community engaged artist. So I think that's something that we all need to kind of be reminded of sa ating sarili at paano pangalagaan yung ating sarili. And have good friends, good friends natin. Di ba? Ayun, good collective.
I think Holden would like to add.
And to add on that, and I like this conversation of having relationships inside, not necessarily like a romantic relationship, but relationships with students, with yourself. And also, there's also complexities with how your students would receive that kind of vulnerability that comes from their teachers. And that's also have been a critique of many engaged pedagogies, that some students might feel coerced na nagsishare tayo ng traumas natin, and they would feel coerced to also share their own traumas. So those are things that are really part of our classrooms, that students might feel that, bakit ako nagsishare nung ganito? Hindi naman part ng syllabus namin to. Why am I fleshing out some of my hurt? Hindi naman namin, I cannot regulate this. And aminin naman natin that most of our students, even ourselves, even us, are not trained to regulate emotions. We are not trained in the classroom to really understand how we can articulate our own traumas, how we can articulate our own emotions inside the classrooms, and how we can siguro create relationships out of it. So kaya din sinasabi nila, ala na, trauma dumping na naman tong classes na to. And that's always, one critique of, like, for instance, we're teaching public speaking. Whenever we try to elicit, of course, narratives of our students, because of course, this is the point of, like, decentering speakership, or like decentering the public speaker identity, na parang you can also be a public speaker. So of course we try to elicit narratives from our students. So they tend to notice that parang, okay, some of the students might tend to share more than the others. So there's a balance and complexities on that. So, and I think it's also a good reflection for us teachers, like how to handle that, how to take in those kinds of narratives, how do we process it? And sometimes we don't have any means to process it. Because bago yung narinig natin to eh. So anong gagawin namin dun sa kind of content that they have? So yeah.
May idadagdag pa ba? Sige. Alright, so now that we have sort of surfaced the emotional labor it takes to really queer the classroom, we can now proceed to the next part of our discussion, which is faculty preparation and institutional support. But since we are talking about care, support, magkakaroon po tayo ng 5-minute break.
Yes.
No? So ayan, as part of our way to center care in our discussion, kami po ay magpapahinga muna for 5 minutes lang, and then we will come back to discuss again what faculty members need, actually, not just in terms of resources but also emotional support in their process of queering our classrooms. So again, we will be back po after 5 minutes. Sana nandyan pa rin po kayo pagbalik namin.
See you then. Welcome back to our Queering the Classroom roundtable discussion. In the previous part of our discussion, before the health break, we all talked about concrete experiences, practical experiences in the classroom. We talked about the gift of the humanities to, let's say, practices within the classroom, which is a lot of relationality. And I think this is something that is not always talked about when we talk about outcomes-based education. What it means to be not just a good teacher, but maybe even a good person, right? Which is very much a humanities, to a certain degree also social sciences kind of question, right? That it's not things that we said earlier that can easily be measured and that standardized across an institution. And as education gets more neoliberal, we start to feel these pressures of quantification, standardization, very much against this idea of reflexivity, change, interactions with students, and the changing meanings of what it means to be a student and a teacher, right? And here we're not just talking about making certain changes to the content of the syllabus itself, because sometimes when I think a lot of the mainstream talks about queering the curriculum, they just talk about, okay, is there a queer person in the book? You know, and then that's it. Or is there some kind of representation as a form of tokenism? But as we've been speaking today, we've learned that it's not just about that. It's about the whole entire approach towards the classroom. So earlier we had a bit of a talk about what vulnerability does one as a teacher and also as a student bring into the classroom, that's reciprocity, let's say, or the responsibility on both sides of a classroom. And I also would like to add that there's a third, maybe there are some third parties here, which is the larger institutional and societal context under which education takes place. So maybe in line with that, and also with what we discussed earlier, I'd like to pose the question, how do we prevent the labor, so we talked about emotional labor, no? Falling on the same small group of people? How can others, the institution, or the way we conduct our classes help with that, easing maybe this burden of, you know, the same people, the same teachers, or dun sa Reddit, di ba, yung mga the best profs, di ba, may mga ganyan-ganyan, from falling into the same group of people?
Probably the same people who are invited in this kind of roundtable discussions.
Here we are again.
At inaanyayaan namin ang lahat na makiisa.
Sana next year, ibang tao na, ibang face.
Correct.
Yes.
So, I think one institutional support that can be given to faculty members is, sabi ko sana, pero of course, having enough spaces. If in terms of emotional and siguro in terms of labor, emotional labor and taking care of ourselves, siguro faculty members and teachers should be able to have spaces where they can rest.
Correct.
Of course, coming from a college with no building, it's also important for us to have our own space where we can have our own discourse, where we can have our own conversations with each other outside of our academic hat. Now, we can just rest and talk about life outside of the academe. So I think it's also important for us to have those kinds of spaces. Also spaces of discourse within the department, within our academic colleagues, where we can talk, discourse, argue regarding how teaching is. What is expected of us. And those kinds of conversations would lead to probably a systemic change. For instance, curricular revisions. Shout out kasi curricular revisions namin and tomorrow ipe-present sa University Council. So, and those And these kinds of conversations led us to understand and to add, for instance, rhetoric and gender, performance and identities as courses, critical approaches in instructional communication, where we introduce gender-affirming pedagogies, feminist pedagogies. So those kinds of conversations where the spaces allowed faculty members to have are very important so that hindi lang kami naburden na those kinds of subjects and courses would be inherited by the queer people. But they can also be taught by, for instance, allies in the department. And those conversations could lead to them being interested, being curious about it, and how they were able, and they can able to siguro share their own in those courses and spaces.
Thanks so much.
Totoo. Saka ang saya kaya mga bakla ng classroom, di ba? I feel like I'd like to highlight... Are we... Sorry. I feel like I'd like to highlight on what we have right now. We have legislative and social policy changes that we have witnessed in the past decade. No? In terms of basic education, DepEd released the gender-responsive basic education policy in 2017, which reiterates the value of gender and development committees na there's 5% budget in gender mainstreaming, right? Tapos, it also ensures that that policy, that law, ensures that school administrators are responsible in ensuring enabling learning environments free from gender-based violence, discrimination na nararanasan ng mga queer students natin ngayon. Pangalawa, in the university level, at least in UP, we have guidelines on affirming transgender and gender non-conforming individuals' live names, honorifics, and pronouns too. In practice, sa aming mga prof, nakikita namin sa class list namin, ang kanilang mga live names at kanilang pronouns, and that guides us how to address our students correctly, no? Because giving them these linguistic resources affirms their identities. Meron pa, sa UP din merong guidelines in promoting women's empowerment and gender equality, which could be our guidelines too as educators. Sabi ni Holden, hindi lang kami. Lahat to, babae, bakla, lalaki, non-binary individuals, non-binary teachers are all held accountable in queering the classroom, right? Pero agree din na nagiging trend na it's all individualized commitments at the end of the day. But I believe that it's all about implementation, but implementing it seriously and intently. And gusto kong i-end that we should always hold the state and the administrators accountable in protecting human rights of each individual, especially queer people. No? That we recognize that gender is not only an additive identity of a person, rather an important facet of everyone, right? Gender is all about your sense of self, your desires, pleasures, joys, kung kanino ka nagkaka-crush, kung sino gustong makasama mo sa buhay, right? But also, it's beyond that. Gender decides who is normal and who is not normal, right? Who's the default student and who's the deviant student that has to be disciplined or corrected, right? So, matingkad yung papel na ginagampanan ng kasarian natin sa pang-araw-araw na buhay, lalo na sa paaralan. At malaki ang gampanin ng Estado in protecting and celebrating these identities para hindi lang siya individualized.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that. No, very important talaga yung space dito sa usapin natin kasi very clear naman na part of what makes teaching so demanding is yung hindi pag-recognize dun sa at pag-invisibilize dun sa care work that we all do. And part of what makes that care work so difficult is that usually walang space for us to care. No, for example, when I used to teach sa UP Manila, wala kaming individual faculty rooms. So, imagine a department of 20 people. Sa isang classroom siya, na doon kami lahat and medyo nakaka-relate yung mga
We can
friends ko
imagine.
dito.
We can
Kami
really
nag-uumpukan
imagine.
kami sa isang
Oo.
sala.
So, just imagine, yung mga sinasabi like ni Lacano na parang, you're willing to have these conversations, to have this human connection, interactions with your students. Saan mo siya gagawin? Sa hallway? Katabi ng teacher na baka yun yung gusto niyang pag-usapan or mag-confide in kasi yun yung teacher na nag-handle ng class kung saan siya nahihirapan. Or for example, there's just something personal happening, no? At hindi pa siya ready ibunyag sa buong department na yun nangyayari sa kanya. Teachers might be willing to care, to go above and beyond yung mandates namin. But if we don't have those spaces, di ba, we're also limited in our capacity. In relation to that, no, and this is more a critique of yung very neoliberal approach, not just to learning but to teaching, is that weirdly, hindi binibilang yung care work na ginagawa ng mga teachers. No, for example, yung kaming mga lecturers, mga part-time faculty, we're still expected and required to be available for 10 additional hours each week for consultation. Pero hindi ito kasama dun sa bayad namin. No, and usually it's in this consultation hours na doon nangyayari yung nag-open up yung estudyante, nag-reach out siya, nagtatanong siya not just about the class itself, but in my experience, for example, kasi alam nila nagtuturo ako ng health, may estudyante ako bilang mag-open up na parang, I would like to seek mental health professional services. Would you know how to reach out? Or for example, yung very simple na, I'm interested in this research or this line of work. Could we maybe talk outside of class to discuss this more? Walang ganong space, walang ganong pagkilala. And that's something that institutions can do better moving forward. Not just yung institution natin, but all across the country. Kasi, I think I was talking to a colleague about it just today, na parang very dire yung mga experiences ng faculty members sa UP. But if we go beyond UP as well, other state universities, nagsasuffer din sila kasi actually mas worse yung conditions or mas exacerbated yung conditions that they're exposed to. No? So yun yung sasabihin kong in terms of space. In relation to that, I think, and this is part of the last thing I'll say, is that I hope we have more conversations or more spaces for queer classrooms themselves. No, I think a lot in relation to the conversation about making our GEs more industry friendly or in light of yung recent curriculum revisions. No, hopefully we have more room to propose classrooms that are queer in the sense na hindi lang sinususugan yung mga queer at trans issues across various fields, but there are spaces to actually rethink yung mga taken for granted assumptions about our own fields, no? Whether it's in the social sciences, humanities, sciences, economics, so on and so forth. I think those spaces are very much important to the life force of the university, and it's really what will save us from just succumbing to AI and climate change and all of these things that really dehumanize us. No.
Yes.
I'd just like to quickly say that I hope that these things that Jeff and Luis are bringing up, for example, gender mainstreaming, having more inclusive classrooms, I hope the institutions don't see these things as rewards or the goodwill of benevolent superiors that they can give us because it's popular or because we're acting excellently, that they can withhold when we're not acting in line anymore or when the general consensus is a little less progressive. No? These things should be done, not because because they're popular or not because they're a reward. These are done because they're basic rights. And unfortunately, this kind of mindset is very prevalent that a lot of people think it's okay to misgender a trans person just because they've done something wrong or because they don't like them. No, it's not, okay? Because gendering someone correctly, it's not a privilege or a reward. It's a basic human right. And ultimately, this is something which doesn't just benefit queer people or queer students, it also benefits everybody. Having an inclusive workspace, having teachers having their own offices, it's not just an opportunity to address problems of queer students, but it's something which benefits, it's something which benefits everybody. Which is why I think, of course, it's important to remind institutions of their responsibilities. But it's also important to remind institutions that there's a union and that collective action has achieved quite a bit, quite a lot, and that people have their limits, and that when these limits are reached, they can bind together for even greater collective action.
Actually, susugan
Yes,
ko
si
si
Marcel,
Lacan. Actually, arouse, organize, mobilize. And always challenge the institutions. And kasama din sa pag-organisa at sa isang parang kolektibong aksyon, yung patuloy na magsaliksik din, no, lalo na ng mga local expressions ng gender natin, no. This is part of the decolonial project din, no, na grounded, no, sa ating mga salita, kultura, mga expressions na maaaring hindi nakapaloob dun sa makakanluranin halimbawa ng mga pananaw, no, yung maaari nating makita, no, sa ating practices, kultura, at paraan ng pagdalumat, no, paraan ng parang habitus, sabi nga ni Bourdieu, no, sa ating sariling konteksto. Kasi mahalaga yun, I think, no, kasi hindi naman wholesale yung mga teorya na naaaral natin, no. Kaya kailangan laging merong pagsasalikop ng practice at saka ng teorya, yung sabi nga natin, praxis. So nakikita natin yun, hindi lang sa pagsasaliksik, kung hindi sa pag-oorganisa mismo, sa paglubog sa mga indigenous people, sa halimbawa, na maaaring may sariling pakahulugan, maaaring may sariling practice ng complexities ng gender relations, or non-complexity. Baka simple lang yan sa ilang mga kultura, no. So ayun, palagay ko magkasalikop at magkasabay din nating tinitingnan yung pag-challenge sa institution, gender mainstreaming na sinasabi ni Jeff, Luis at saka Holden, but at the same time mag-organisa, no, at lumubog doon sa malawak din na tao. At maaring doon natin makita yung mas nakakakiliting mga konsepto ng kasarian na maaaring hindi pa natiteorya or kung ano man, no, at hindi pa nasasalikop noong mga alam natin ng mga termino, at ito yung paraan ng pagpapalawak, so laging expansive. So siguro yun yung dagdag ko.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Rosel. We are running out of time for our discussion, but maybe if there are any additional comments or reactions to what's been discussed. I do very much like this idea that Lacan, for example, talked about, that if you think about inclusion intentionally when you think about schooling, education, curriculum, or even on the level of the institution, you make things easier for everyone. So, for example, we just talk about architecture. There is a ramp in this very building where we are in, the Institute of Biology. And that ramp helps if there's no elevator. If the elevator isn't working, it's not just to make it more accessible. Everyone can use the ramp. And I think that's something that's very valuable that we can draw from the intersectionality of queering, that you make it good for everyone. And now we'll proceed, I think, to the open forum. We have been collecting some questions from our live audience that will be flashed on screen. They are, I think, when you ask a question, if there are still further questions, you have to state the name and the affiliation. But first, I'll read the question. So, from Jasmine. Sinong Jasmine to? From UPCWGS. Have you ever received pushback about your attempts to be inclusive, and how do you deal with pushback? Paano si Ma'am Rosel? Okay, anyone?
Voice lang siya.
Voice lang, ano, from The Voice. Ayan, all right. Pushback. Anyone like to share?
I think UP students are generally open-minded and inclusive in terms of how they treat gender discourses and queer discourses. I haven't had comments from my set that I'm too gay to function, I guess. Or I haven't... I'm not sure, but in terms of... I had colleagues that would say or that would narrate that some students might not be comfortable talking about their own stories. Students might not be comfortable talking or fleshing out their own feelings and emotions. I think those are general pushbacks. But I had pushbacks dealing with professionals. Talking, let's say for instance, I have been invited to talk about SOGI SC in a state university for Women's Month. So, and one question is, di ba pang June yan? So, yun yung question sa akin. Di ba yung social essay pang June discussion? Kasi nga, di ba, Pride?
May timing.
May timing, that's correct. So, of course, and it's more difficult to address, especially this is an online webinar. So it's more difficult to address professionals who have internalized such beliefs and assumptions. And of course, I answered and responded gracefully. I think that so yes, even a woman could understand it, could benefit from it. So ganon. So parang as much as possible, sinimplify ko na lang rather than escalating it. But I think, in terms of pushbacks, I think that those are things that I have experienced.
Okay, you want?
Sometimes I get pushback as a person.
Yes.
Yeah. UP, yes, of course. There are a lot of great people in UP and like you guys, but UP can also be a contradiction because a lot of people think it's this great progressive hub where everyone can be who they are, but it's not. A lot of the age-old phobias, homophobia, transphobia, a lot of the classism, ableism that you find outside of UP is still present in UP and can sometimes be even more magnified. UP was the only place where I ever got kicked out of a CR. It was in a college. I won't say which college. I was using the CR, and then this person in the CRs, she tells me, pang faculty lang to. And I was like, oh, faculty member po ako. And then she was like, no, faculty lang ng college na to. And I was like, later I realized, oh, why would she even ask that? Like, why would that be a concern for her unless she didn't want me in the CR? No, and I think that a lot of us have this idea that if you're kind of faced with those microaggressions, if you're faced with transphobia or homophobia, if you don't stand your ground, suddenly you're a bad gay, that you didn't stand up for your community, no? But something that a really dear friend told me once gave really helped me because she once told me that I have to choose my battles. No, I have to choose my battles. I think that's something that's applicable to all of us. We
Yeah.
all have to choose our battles. We all have to know when we should really push back and when maybe we can reserve our strength for something that's not just more productive, but that's for people, but also more productive for us, because even, responding to transphobia, homophobia, that's incredibly draining. And that could instead be channeled towards more fruitful endeavors, I think.
I actually had a question na sort of na answer, and I want to put it out there since it's also related to the question, and I want it to also be a part of the discussion. In that process of dealing with those pushbacks, in holding other people in our community accountable as well in this process of inclusion, how do we also, again, center yung care in that work, no, na pinag-uusapan natin kanina? Because a lot of the language in the advocacy ay very sanctions, very punitive. Some are saying naman na we also have to recognize na other people may not have same access to these types of discussions, no. But at the same time, no, as a queer person myself, as queers, no, parang andun yung feeling na tayo na naman yung mag-a-adjust, no. Parang we don't want to police them kasi parang ayaw naman natin maging police. But alam mo yun, tayo naman yung ipopolice natin in the process, diba? So may mga ganong dilemmas that some people are facing. No? I want to know, what do you think about that? No? How do we deal na ikaw na ngayon naagabyado minsan and you are still expected to be of your best behavior?
Yeah, I guess I can share. I'm non-binary, so I use they, them pronouns. So very common for people because I don't look they, them-ish to people. I don't know what that means, but for them, I just register as male. Whether out of respect or they just don't understand how I am. So may mga ganun yung nakakapagod nga na microaggressions. I'm like, it got to a point some well-intentioned people were like, and I would consider this pushback in the sense that even if it is well-intentioned, it still reflects yung culture, no, institutionally and just socio-politically. Parang, so I was like, hey, you might just want to not put your pronouns kasi older people won't really understand. Baka maging issue pa siya. Which to me was just like, great, but whatever. Pero yung case na, ang ganda nung sinabi kasi ni Brian, parang, a lot of it has to do with care pa rin eh, and how, especially as queer people and trans people, non-binary folk, we're not just expected to educate people about these things, but we're expected to care for them as they unlearn things, if they wish to learn things. There's one conference where I was invited to speak at, na the topic was actually about making the classroom more inclusive. And this was among health and medical professionals. Akala ko ano siya, parang staff ng nung university na yun. No, these are like attending physicians, deans, and administrators of the university. And I was like, okay, how do I frame equity and inclusion under care? And it was something I had to be intentional about because I'm very cognizant na parang, if you just frame this as a SOGSC thing, a lot of them will talk about biology, a lot of them will talk about religion, a lot of them will talk about personal beliefs. So I framed my talk around, not just gender inclusion, but like being inclusive intersectionally as part of teaching and modeling care and equity in their case, to their students, no? I still got those questions na parang, but we're religious, we're Catholic, we're parang, what if the student does not want to follow the rules? And so I had to kind of be clear, no, na parang, or I had to, that was a battle I was willing to take on. And I said, we have to go back to the premise of why we're all here, or why you're all here, which is that you are teaching future healthcare providers to care for communities. Ipagkakait nyo ba, not just to that one student, but to the potential communities they will serve in the future, quality healthcare, simply because they're trans or they're non-binary, or because the way that they would like to show up to class just doesn't conform to how you want them to. The issue is about uniform, no? And for a lot of them, they really couldn't deny that kind of framing of care. And I think that speaks also to when you do organize, when you do engage in these and choose your battles, you really have to know your audience and who's listening so that you can be most effective when you are queering your classrooms and advocating for more queer spaces in that way.
Thank you. Yes, Jeff.
Hello.
Yes.
Ako, I appreciated that question again. Because as a queer person, you always have to make yourself intelligible, no? For you to be translated, to be understood. And I think we always assume that each person comes from the place of curiosity and innocence at the same time. But tas dun tayo papasok, maybe there's a space for educating them. But sometimes I also understand the other side of the tension where sometimes it gets to a point of saturation. Why do I always have to explain? Why do I always have to be responsible on this? Kasi nakakapagod nga lagi, lalo na kapag hindi ka pinapakinggan. So gusto ko lang re-emphasize yung sinabi nila Han into addressing this tension na always choose your battles. Know how to exit gracefully, but also being open to critical dialogues, no? Because at the end of the day, this is the goal of gender and development, to address not only women's and queer people's issues, but also to address gender relations amongst all ourselves. So we always have to participate in this relations of power imbalances. Tapos I'd also like to share na one way para makapasok doon is in the case of Spanish language teaching, ay to create inclusive materials. Kunwari sa amin our department effort in the Department of European Languages in the Spanish section, we're currently revising Cuentos. Cuentos is a Spanish textbook for Filipinos and by Filipinos. I'd like to shout out kay kay Professors Miguel, kay Ana, kay Clara, kay Mai at kay Jevic. So it embodies the principles of DEI principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. At hindi lang ito magagamit ng UP Spanish teachers, but also it gets to be mainstreamed by our partner universities and even TESDA, who's also giving classes of Spanish. Reinterpreting Spanish from its heteronormative and also its colonial underpinnings to a liberatory space where everyone can be themselves and para maihayag yung sarili nila in another language. So yon, papasok lagi sa institusyon at sa malalaking institusyon nga. Yan. That's how we deal with pushbacks.
Yes, yes.
And hello. And just to add shortly, when my colleague and I, Charles and I, did a deliberative forum for an anti-discrimination ordinance in Makati City, our team lead, Nicole, at that time, mentioned that it's important as facilitators and educators to be aware that we shouldn't be calling out people, but instead of calling them in, to understand where they're coming from, to understand their background, so that we might be able to also teach them and also siguro relate to them on bakit ganun yung nagagaling yung opinions mo, and then so that we can also assess ourselves and be reflective and how we can help them. So yun lang.
Thanks so much. Si Ma'am Rosel, because kita sa screen, but yes.
Sorry, tutuntungan ko lang yun, no? Kasi siguro expand natin yung idea ng education, no? Na kung critical pedagogy yung pinag-uusapan natin, hindi yan one way, no? So ito ay nanggagaling din pati sa tacit knowledge, embodied knowledge, conversations. In fact, pwede nang sagutin yung susunod na tanong, no? Na kasi yung susunod na tanong parang paano mag-queer yung estudyante sa kapwa estudyante o sa classroom, no? So, sumegway, di ba? Nag-moderate si bakla.
Tama.
Ah, hindi, kasi importante yung expansive na idea ng education na tayong lahat ay natututo hindi lang sa may isang nagtuturo o nagagaling sa isang source, yung pagkatuto. Kung hindi, ito ay isang reciprocal co-learners nga ang sinasabi, no, sa isang espasyo within the institution but also outside the institution, lalo na yung mga I don't know what it's called, but informal, non-formal types of education, no. In fact, may education na again, no, i-emphasize ko yung mga embodied, mga tacit knowledge, no, that it's not necessarily articulated through words, di ba, or mga konsepto na ihahayag, no, sa pamamagitan ng mga pangungusap. At mahalagang makita ang lahat ng ito bilang bahagi ng educational process. No, so ito yung idea ng expansive education. Kasi sa totoo lang, bahagi ng ating advocacy, kasama ng advocacy, yung patuloy, no, na educational process. Hindi lang, sinasabi na to ng mga colleagues ko kanina pa, no, hindi lang mga queers educating non-queers or whatever, if you want to other people. We don't want to other people, actually. Yan yung esensya. No? But pati sa amin mismo, no? sa hanay mismo, ika nga. No? Because we continue, patuloy yan. No? Patuloy na ang educational process ay patuloy sa amin mismo. At kaya nga, laging merong parang laging may prompt or provocation for self-reflexivity, critical self-reflexivity. Dahil tayong lahat ay umiinog at dapat patuloy na nag-aaral at natututo. So siguro, yan yung indirectly nasagot doon sa next question. No? Bilang mga estudyante, bahagi tayo ng malawak na idea ng education. No? So, kasama dyan ay co-learners tayo, nagiging bahagi tayo ng paghuhubog ng safe space sa isang classroom upang hindi lang tayo kundi mga kaklase natin at pati guro, sabi nga ni Holden kanina, no? Pati ang guro ay magkaroon ng espasyo para sa kanyang sariling pagkatuto within the classroom. And I guess that's part of the idea of queering the classroom, no? Or pag queer kasi sa akin, tinatanggal mo yung fluid, tinatanggal mo yung matitigas na boundaries or borders, no? So part of queering is being able to create a fluid space for conversation and expansive idea of education as well. So yan.
Ang ganda ng pagka-segue sa susunod na tanong. Who is from GEM, UP Cebu? Parang may attribution.
Nabasa ko eh.
So ayun. Yes,
Yeah.
Luis, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted, parang, ang ganda kasi nung sabi ni Ma'am Rosel, no? So, I'll respond na quickly, no? Siguro, and we did talk about it earlier, no? Parang even students have assumptions about teachers and how they should hold the class or how they should facilitate it. I think what I appreciated most about college when I was a student was that I always expected my teachers to hold classes differently. Weirdly, so parang for me, okay, yung first major requirement, parati tong alay. Kasi hindi ko alam paano magpapa-exam, paano si teacher. So, that's one concrete way. I think you need to be open to various ways that your teachers will hold their classes. Siguro yung pangalawa is, on the teacher's end, we should cultivate this. No, na we need to encourage our students to ask questions. No, na hindi lang sila yung tatanggap nung kung ano mang sinabi. But, in my classes, what has helped, I would say, my students queer the classroom would be on my end, no, Kasi hindi naman ako yung estudyante dun sa classroom per se. But for me to actually take up that hat sometimes. No, na kahit na ako yung course instructor, kapag nag-share yung estudyante ko, I take off that hat. No, in that sense, the most that I would be doing is facilitating. And I know this kind of approach doesn't work for all students kasi minsan hindi sila sanay. Gusto niya may structure or gusto niya, basta si teacher, mag-lecture siya, pipicturean ko yung slides, i-record ko siya, kikinig ako, mag-assign siya. Yun yung ideal. But in my classes, for example, like sa health sociology, ang dami kong students biglang nag-open up about their experience with the healthcare system na actually very valuable. No, because it puts into context ano yung pinag-uusapan namin. Whether teorya siya or konsepto ng healthcare system. And so that's also valuable for me as the teacher to recognize na teachers din sila. In that sense, they can teach me and other students. But ang mahirap is minsan walang openness yung ibang students to that kind of approach. So may mga feedback akong natatanggap na yung class ni Prof. Abesamis, nag-rant lang siya or yung mga ibang students, no? And I understand, no, may pinanggagalingan sila. But again, babalikan ko yung premise, no, na parang for us to really queer classrooms, we have to see the classroom as a relational space. Hindi lang teacher yung in charge, hindi lang teacher yung nandun. So hindi lang teacher yung may dala nung learning. So kasama yung students doon. And so students should also be open, no, to different kinds of narratives, different ways of learning, different approaches to teaching and all of these things. No? And at the very least, they should be open to collaborating with their teachers and their classmates to figure out what's the best way for all of us to learn.
We also learn a lot from our students as well.
Yeah, that's
We're
true.
Not, it's not just a hierarchical authoritarian kind of, I'm the teacher and you have to do what I say, diba? Parang it's a two-way thing sometimes, yes. Okay, maybe some other sharings?
Ako, I use chikahan and kwentuhan as a strategy, and
Ay.
I argue that chikahan is a queer method in itself.
Yes.
I'm coming from a foreign language class, and I give them space for dialogues amongst themselves, and sa 4 na taon kong pagtuturo ng Espanyol, na pagtanto ko na students like talking about themselves, and they also like hearing stories about each other at the same time. And I think itong chikahan as a strategy, it challenges power imbalances between teachers and students, and that knowledges could also come from them and not from me. And also that challenges that also challenges the monopoly of knowledge is not from me dahil ako rin ay natututo. Tapos, yun, it challenges power imbalances between roles of teachers and students, but also forms of knowledges na yung kaalaman ay manggagaling din sa kanila. And also it cultivates community, friendship amongst themselves, and when they leave the classroom, they eat together. And I think that's an act of queering, forming humanness na nawawala ngayon.
Yung lack of third spaces din, no?
Correct.
And I think that's very much linked to what we talked about earlier, where we can do these things and how, and designing our own spaces. Okay, Ryan, sorry, did you want to say something? You were looking earlier. We are coming towards the end of our program, unfortunately. I wish we could continue the discussion, but as we're wrapping up, maybe a statement, if anyone wants to share, a closing statement of what should happen, what could be done, or anything that you'd like to share. Anything?
I believe.
I believe, yes.
First, transition. Sure.
Yes!
You want to clear the classroom, transition. Secondly, I think that maybe coming to terms with our gender and sexuality, these are big steps, but it's always a continuous process. Sometimes I think there's a danger in thinking that there is a decent way to be gay or a decent way to be trans, which is unfortunately still replicated by a lot of gay people and trans people themselves, which is ironic to me because we should try to deconstruct and question these ideas of what it means to be a decent queer person. In fact, a lot of our queerness stems from the fact that, yes, we do unsettle people and we do question these prevailing norms. So I think that rather than think of what we should be as queer people, as trans people, we just try to explore what we are. We just try to explore what we are. Oftentimes, people talk so much about queer excellence. Let's talk about queer mediocrity. Let's be mediocre. Instead of talking about pride all the time, let's talk about sloth. Kasi minsan pagod na lang tayo. So let's not put so much pressure on ourselves.
Anyone?
Ako na, para 5 minutes to go eh.
Yes, yes.
Ang buhay ng bakla ay masayang tunay. Charos. Hindi, bukod sa masaya at siguro yung aking provocation, yung last provocation is that wag natin din kalimutan na sa lalaban, pakikipaglaban at advocate ng ating kasarian, ay ito ay lagi nakaangkla sa sa karapatang pantao, whether we're talking about yung mas malawakang idea ng inclusivity, pagpanis sa diskriminasyon at prejudice, pag-other sa hindi natin nauunawaan na mga disposisyon or identities at equity, so kasabay ng pag-assert natin ng ating queer identity ay kasabay nito o dapat kaangkla nito yung paglaban din natin sa mas malawakang karapatang pantao at equity at sabi na nga kanina at pagiging makatao. So, yun. Hindi siya hiwalay.
Yes.
For me, queering the classroom, just like education, is a lifelong process. So it entails compassion to yourself as a teacher and to your students. Hindi ibig sabihin nagki-queer ka ng classroom ay paglabas ng mga estudyante mo ay na sila, inclusive, progressive na sila paglabas ng classroom niyo. Bading na sila. So bading na sila. But I think that's the ideal of it. That's the intention of it. But we must also understand that there are realities beyond identities. There are realities that are beyond ano ba yung nangyayari sa classroom mo. So, just like us, we've been teaching for how many years and nandito pa rin tayo, nag-uusap, and it's also important to have this ongoing conversations about this. So, yeah, and I hope to have these kinds of conversations in the coming future. Hopefully, wag na sanang paulit-ulit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sana meron namang iba.
With more
Queer
STEM
transformative
people.
naman.
Yes.
Transformative syllabus naman ang inaano namin.
Straights as the new queers.
So hopefully there's our different things to talk about. So yan.
Yung kailangan ng workshop. Any other closing statements? I think yes. I personally, and also coming from a background in the humanities and social sciences, we recognize that we live in a world that is fluid. I remember that when I was walking alongside a garden in Europe, the person who was with me, who's actually a prominent scholar, pero hindi ko siya in a name drop, saw that all the plants were in different boxes. And then she says, here, there is this tendency, also probably very Eurocentric, modernist tendency to keep things separate. They don't let plants grow together. And I think it's, precisely this kind of postmodern ethos where we have to live with a world where you have to expect the unexpected. And being intersectional and being intentional in that is a way of dealing with our present realities. So when we have the flexibility and the inclusion to deal with this kind of globalized world where things don't always turn out as you expected them to be, like they said in this modern era, then I think that's good for all. That's good for education in general. And that's the kind of strength that queering brings to the curriculum and to society in general. And with that, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for coming today. Thank you very much. And to our audience as well. And we hope to see you in our next events. Thank you very much and have a good evening. may ano kasama. Si Ma'am Rosel nilagay yung certificate sa
Thank you, Ma'am Rosel.
Okay.
Thank you,
Pwede na
Rosel.
ba ako mag-leave?
Pwede na daw po. Ay.
Okay.
Tapos, pero yung ano, yung picture, kasama ba si Ma'am Rosel sa picture?
Paano ako sasama? Doon ako para akong Diyos
pwedeng
ang
i-picture si
ganon.
Ma'am Rosel dito sa likod.
Oo, ganon. Parang ano.
Or dito
Diyos
lang tayo
ah.
mag... Okay, sige. Sige, hintayin ng konti. Okay.
Ako yung AI. Eh, sabi ni Luis kanina. Pwede ba i-post?
Hello. Yes. So smile ka na. So
Okay.
3 3 2 1. Okay, thank you.
Maraming salamat for adjusting to my blocking. Para maging inclusive.
Okay na tayo.
Okay na. Alright. Congrats everybody.
Ay,
See you around. Leave na ako
yan,
ha,
si ano.
Frankie.
Okay, sige. Thank you so much po.
Thank you.